as a young reporter, you interview this Vietnam veteran. What was that experience like? What did you go into that experience thinking? Any preconceived notions, and what was the actual experience of sitting down with a veteran of the Vietnam War like?
Well, that kind of helped shape my thinking a little bit, right? Because and here's where we maybe get off a little bit on a tangent, but I think it kind of goes to what you're asking, right? And so when I was coming up in the 80s, right? And again, I was still just a kid, but I was always interested in these things, right? And just much more so than other things. And so I started look, but I also started to look at the way that Vietnam vets were portrayed in the media, right? Especially the entertainment media, but also the news media too. But when we're talking about entertainment media, the Vietnam vet, he was always crazed, he was always dangerous, he was always, some drug-addled, fiend or something like that. And I even then, to my young eyes, I was like, that doesn't seem credible to me, right? And so, as you see in the dedication in the book, I dedicate the book to the 2.7 million Americans who served in Vietnam over the course of our commitment there. Um, and I did, so I come into this interview with this man back in my reporter days, and I had a few of those little stereotypes kicking around in my head. I couldn't help it. I've been sort of inundated, even though and here I get to this guy, and he's just a wonderful gentleman. He had built this accounting practice. It was he built a family, a life. And he was just a guy who went and did something very hard in a very hard place. And that's what most of them, the vast majority of our veterans are just guys and gals who go do a hard thing. And it should not be beyond our capacity to say thanks and give them respect, right? Where were the ticker tape parades for the Vietnam vets? That's always a question, and it's a good question. And so, it took years. So, in a way, you kind of like these sort of projects, from my perspective, look at or a way of just sort of casting a light on it and of that time and those people and giving them a little bit of due, which just like every other generation, they went off to war, answered their nation's call, and so why can't they be venerated and given respect, and why can't their stories be told, right? So, and interestingly enough, he did not want to talk to me at first, the source, right? This Vietnam vet, because he had seen so much of the way his brothers had been portrayed in the media, especially the entertainment media. And so it took me a while to convince him, look, and I finally just did the old reporter thing. I said, let's just sit down and talk for a while. We don't have to turn the recorders on. We don't have to do anything. Let's just chat. And after a while, it just built some trust with him. And then we ended up having we talked hours and hours, and we would, and he just was so open and forthcoming about all of his experiences. And then we're looking at pictures. And then we ended up getting a really fine story, sort of highlighting this kind of pillar of the community who built a whole life here. But when he was a kid, when he was 19 or 20 years old, he went off and did something that his country asked him to do. And he should not be wary about a journalist coming to talk to him. He should not be wary about the way the next movie was going to portray him and his brothers, right? That's the way I felt. That's the way I continue to feel. And that's what I try to do, is bring these things through in the stories, the books, the magazine articles, and all the rest.
Yeah, I 100% agree. That's something my dad always talks about because he's sort of your same age. When the Vietnam War was going on, he was just a little kid, but seeing these Vietnam veterans who just went through hell over there, who were simply answering their nation's call of duty, and they return home, they're being spit on in the airports, absolutely disgraced by the country and the people that they just served. It really is disgraceful and it's sad. And this is sort of what interests me in terms of the Vietnam War is obviously the military and political side of it, but also the cultural side of it. Because we go 20, 30 years prior to World War II, this is the greatest generation. These guys are put on a pedestal, and rightfully so. But World War II was so black and white. It was the good guys versus the bad guys, and then 30 years later, our public trust in the institution of the military completely took a 180. And it was a completely different story being painted in the media of these brave men and women who were just boys going over to fight for their country. What to linger on that a little more, what do you think changed from World War II and the greatest generation to the Vietnam War, and these same young men and women who are answering their nation's call of duty, going and fighting for their country, to now being referred to as the silent generation, spit on in the airports, vilified in the media?
Boy, lots of stuff to unpack there. I think what changed, there's a concept in uh, political science, especially like international relations and so forth, that talks about the youth bulge. Whenever you have a lot of young people in the country at any given time, it can cause some upheaval, right? Um, you know, be that as it may, one way or another, depending on how you look at it. And certainly the baby boomers that were born after that generation that you talked about in World War II, they were all, coming of age, 18, 19, 20 years old, right as the Vietnam War was reaching its height. A couple of other things, that tied in the civil rights movement, just various changes in the mores, just, made people look at, overseas conflict in a different way than they had, 20, 30 years prior, right? I mean, even in Korea, there wasn't that kind of, backlash, even though that was every bit as contentious and, and a lot of people looked at it as like, why are we even involved in this and all the rest? I think, there was certainly a backlash to the draft, right? And a lot of the young guys, especially who were against the war, they were really against being drafted themselves and having to go. And so that's one of the reasons why Nixon, he sort of recognized that and started winding down the draft as soon as he got into office. And by 1972, pretty much the draft was over. And he was trying to diffuse that sort of thing. And so all of these things, I think it was like a perfect storm of youth and counterculture and, the draft, the way things were different from 25 years, 30 years prior. All of these things sort of, kind of came together. And, and unfortunately, the Vietnam vets were the ones who kind of took the brunt of that. They were just like any other generation. They answered their nation's call. They went off, did what they were supposed to do, and they did not receive the kind of treatment that previous generations had when they went and fought overseas.
Yeah, it's such an interesting time period. The way culture evolved from the 40s and 50s to the 60s and 70s was completely different. The whole rise of counterculture. And ultimately, I think, like you said, these young people, it's important. Um, they had this rebellious nature about them. And I think at the heart of it was a sentiment of rebelling against America and rebelling against the institutions of America. And I think that just manifested itself in the war. But also, um, the advent of television and daily news was a huge aspect of this, because in World War II, you're getting government sponsored movies that are basically, pro American propaganda on the war.
The newsreels. Right. And you went to a movie and you got sometimes you got a double feature, you got a cartoon and you got a newsreel that kind of showed you what was going on. There wasn't, television wasn't mass spread, and it could have been, but World War II kind of delayed its advent in the United States, but it wasn't. So you went to you had newspapers, magazines, and you went to the newsreels, and that's where you got your information.
Exactly. And you had journalists in World War II, but they're taking pictures, and then these pictures are, um, kind of approved by the government. Like, we have the infamous raising the flag on Iwo Jima. These are very pro-American pictures that stir up a lot of pro-American fervor for the war, support for the war. And then in Vietnam, you have journalists there with video cameras who are capturing the brutality of the war. These massacres, all of this death and destruction, and then it's just being played every day on the news, and people are seeing the brutality firsthand, not being controlled by the government, what is being shown on TV. So I think that that was a huge aspect of it.
Yeah, they call it the first television war, right? And so it was you're bringing this into everyone's living rooms on the nightly news, and they're seeing, and of course, TV. I was a print guy, so I'm not a huge fan of imagery over just something that takes a little bit more substance, a little bit longer to develop. But be that as it may, that is, television has always been reliant upon images, and if something's on fire, if someone's in dire straits, or if something's blowing up, right, the TV cameras are right there to show it, even though it might sort of kind of convey in something that's not really true, but it conveys a sense of what's going on, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't know who said it, um, but someone said, the American people can handle tragedy and ugly pictures on the TV for a day or two, but they can't handle it for months at a time. They get impatient, especially like you said in a democratic society. But the first TV war, that's an interesting way to put it. Do you think that public opinion for World War II would have been different if we had that sort of independent video news journalism, especially in the Pacific theater where some of that fighting was so brutal?
I've often thought that if there were, live broadcasts coming from the beaches at Normandy and the kind of carnage that was witnessed there, and guys trying to get off the landing craft and just being mowed down, and I mean, it would. Uh, I will say that would probably have had a much bigger impact, right? It's a lot different seeing something like that than reading about it in the newspaper, um, or even seeing it in the newsreels, right? Because they were all, as you rightly point out, they were very well scripted, and all the rest. However, the I think the public was also maybe a little bit better prepared for World War II. There's an entire series called Why We Fight. Frank Capra was a famed movie director at that time. But before he was that famed movie director, and It's a Wonderful Life is probably his most well known movie, right? The Christmas classic. And he was certainly gifted. But the government brought him in before that in 1941 to do the Why We Fight series. And it really was meant to educate uh, in this case, the American fighting man as to why he was fighting the war. And I think that there was more of an effort to sort of educate the public, educate the fighting force as to why we're doing what we're doing. And that is to stop an existential threat who's trying to conquer Europe, and they're brutalizing whole nations and so forth. And and Johnson, especially President Johnson, did not want any attention on any of this. He wanted as little attention as possible brought on Vietnam. So he did not go before the public and sort of try to educate them at the level that previous administrations might have when they were involved in foreign wars. And so I think that had something to do with it. This idea that you can kind of fight a war on the sly. Yes, we know that it's going on. We know there are, you know, uh, requirements and commitments and all the rest. But we're not going to talk about it too much, and we're not going to call up the reserves, and we're not going to, utilize the National Guard, right, as have been utilized in wars since. What are the reserves and what are the National Guard? Derisively, some people might say that they're weekend warriors, or part-time soldiers, whatever. They're also older, and they also know a lot, and they also have a lot of skills in regular life that could be brought to bear in a place like Vietnam or any other conflict. They're the guy with the kids and the gal with a career at home and all the rest, and they've been around a little bit, and they're not everyone's not 19. And so but in Vietnam, you saw that over and over, just one conscript after another. So, or even volunteer after another. They're all just generally young. And so by calling up the reserves, calling up, utilizing the National Guard overseas, Johnson could have, brought an entire new dimension and a level of skill and acumen that was lacking in many areas. But he didn't want to do that because he didn't want to call attention to the war. He didn't want anything to do with the war. He just sort of like got pulled into it from various reasons, which are probably beyond our discussion right now.
Yeah, that was always something that really frustrated Johnson because he had such big, lofty ambitions for his domestic agenda, the Great Society. He wanted all the focus there.